This is not a test. This is not a test. Please remain calm.
Unburied dead are coming back to life and seeking human victims.
Seeking human victims. Seeking human victims.
Hello and welcome to Seeking Human Victims, Season 0, Episode 2. I'm Dan the Dragon Wilson, alongside my co-host...
Muji.
Just like Cher, like Madonna, like Prince, just one name, just Muji. He's dropped his surname, folks, right here on Episode 2.
Yeah.
We're back with our esteemed panelists. I have, starting to my left, the third co-founder of One Good Scare Productions. She's a esthetician, a makeup artist, an all-around creative individual, and my dear wife, Miss Anni Wilson. How's it going?
I'm word up. Pretty good.
And returning once again, Jay Stewart. How are you, man?
Man, I'm here. Hanging out with these guys. Bunch of nutcases.
Oh, we're all quite sane around here. I have no idea what you're talking about. I'd also would like to introduce comic book artist, also a former host of the Get Your Pulls Comics podcast, and I guess will be again if it ever returns, Mr. Todd Johnston.
Hey, everybody. It's nice to see everyone so pumped.
The enthusiasm is running through the air. If you can feel the electricity, folks, it's truly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here tonight. Also, the final member of our panel, a longtime friend of mine, a hell of a shredding guitar player and a bassist, and an all-around conceptual musician and smart dude, Mr. Jason Griswold. How's it going?
I tell you, brother, I'm better than a body slam.
Wrong show. But glad to have you nonetheless. So tonight, we're talking about another one of the classics, the ABCs of horror. What is it? It is an in-depth study at what we feel are the top 5 horror movies that, maybe not necessarily of all time, but in terms of breaking into the genre, the top 5 quintessential films that you need to see. You may disagree with this list, as we've said before. That's fine. We will have plenty of other times to discuss other films that you might think belong here. But tonight, we're talking about a film that changed the genre. We're going back to 1978 to talk about the legendary John Carpenter's Halloween. We have to get down to the meat of the matter, dig in below the flesh. It's time for the coroner's report.
The coroner's report.
With Halloween, you really have to go back to John Carpenter, because without Carpenter, this movie does not become what it is. It doesn't take the identity that it does. So his background is very important to the whole thing coming together. At 9 years old, John Carpenter, in a trip to the drive-in theater, saw It Came from Outer Space in 3D in 1953. The fear the movie caused him fascinated him, and it began a love affair with the horror genre and sci-fi and other things that Carpenter went on to do. Like George Romero, who we talked about in the last episode, Carpenter experimented with making movies at a young age. He did home movies with a camcorder. He also came from a musical family, which will become important later. When he went into his teens, he went to college at USC and impressed folks to the point that he raised $30,000 to expand his USC student thesis, Dark Star, into a feature. And that got the attention of the distributors and investors for Assault on Precinct 13, and they funded that movie, which was really Carpenter's first feature-length film that actually got a release. Important to note, Irwin Yablans worked for that distributor And after being impressed with Assault on Precinct 13, he went to Carpenter and advised him that he wanted to make a movie with him and that his first love was horror. And his initial idea for the script was to make a movie called The Babysitter Murders.
Yeah, Yoblin's actually, like you said, he worked for a distributor and they did low budget pictures, and he said they just kind of ran out of low budget pictures to distribute. So he's like, what the hell? Let's make our own movie. So he approached Mustafa Todd, who was a big time investor in movies at the time, was producing some big high budget movies, and decided, like you said, Carpenter was going to be the guy. They saw a lot of talent in him. They basically went to him. Urban Yoblin is actually not almost as important Carpenter. He's probably the most second important guy, though, in the creation of Halloween. I mean, he came up with the idea of let's do the Babysitter Murders. He also came up with the idea of let's set it on Halloween, call it Halloween. He contributed a ton to what ended up being the most important parts of the movie.
You think of all of the contributions that he had. We're going to talk about more of them as this goes on, but he's not really one of the names that comes up in Halloween history, but he's as important as anyone in terms of making it happen. Carpenter was pretty shrewd in these negotiations for a guy who never made a movie other than a college film that he got funded. First of all, he demanded final cut. And he also demanded that he get his name above the title. This was based on his idols of classic Hollywood. And they said if he could do it for $300,000, he could have whatever he wanted. So ultimately, they came to terms. Akkad and Yoblins had saw the success of The Exorcist and kind of hoped to replicate that on a low budget. And they had heard that Carpenter made Assault on Precinct 13 for about $100,000. So they were into this idea. And they actually had assumed that somebody had probably made a movie by that title, but they researched, much to their surprise, there had never been a movie named Halloween up until 1978. Honestly, few movies even about the topic of Halloween up until then. I mean, now you have things like Trick or Treat, who's just one of the greatest horror tributes to the holiday you could have. But back then, this was something surprisingly that yet hadn't been done. When we get into the pre-production, these guys hammered this out with some impressive speed and efficiency. They had a 21-day shooting schedule. Carpenter brought in his then-girlfriend, 21-year-old Deborah Hill, to produce. She was previously a script supervisor on Assault on Precinct 13, and she wrote the first draft. Carpenter came back and wrote the second draft, which is where the Sam Loomis character was added.
It's actually pretty smart. It's something people talk about today, but it rarely happens, where essentially she wrote all the dialogue for all of the teenage girls, because John Carpenter, of course, I don't fucking know how they talk, and then he wrote the dialogue except for Loomis, so that was his specialty, so they traded out on who wrote what, and it worked very well.
And the dialogue between the teenage girls is often praised as being pretty revolutionary for the time, because up until that point, teenagers on television didn't really talk like actual teenagers. And here they did, and they were kind of partaking in activities that real teenagers did. So it was what was really happening in real life, but it's not what was portrayed on the screen.
Revolutionary idea, yet let a young woman write the dialogue for the young women, and it actually sounds like them.
Surprise, surprise. So Carpenter, as he goes into this thing, he credits Psycho as really the beginning of modern horror, as opposed to the gothic horror of Hammer and Universal with your castles and cobwebs. So he felt that Psycho moved horror into the modern era. But what he wanted to do with Halloween is take that and make it mythology. So kind of take it all the way back around full circle. And that's where he came up with the idea of the Shape. A complete inhuman, faceless force of nature. Tommy Lee Wallace, one of the MVPs of the production as well, one of two or three really unsung heroes. Deborah Hill certainly one, Wallace is another. He was a childhood friend of John Carpenter. Carpenter brought him in as a production designer and an editor. He developed the look of the Shape, Michael Myers. They had went through several masks. They knew they wanted a masked killer, that was the general idea, but what was he going to look like? They went through a lot of different mask choices. There was a Richard Nixon mask at one time in the lineup. There was a Spock mask. There was an Emmett Kelly mask, which you may not know that by name, but the famous sad clown mask that you've seen in Halloween every year, bald, 5 o'clock shadow. You know exactly what I'm talking about. They put the Emmett Kelly mask on him, and it was startling. That's pretty disturbing. but it wasn't exactly what they wanted.
It was almost the one that they used, but luckily at the exact same time they were developing what would end up being the Michael Myers mask. It came down to the two of those. They screen tested them both and shot a scene, and luckily they made the correct choice.
Yep, and so it was just an old Captain Kirk mask. It's not a big secret at this point. I think that's probably one of the most well-known odd facts from the Halloween franchise is that Michael Myers is a Captain Kirk William Shatner mask, spray-painted white.
The Shat.
But they only chose Kirk because it was the plainest looking face. It didn't have any unique features or anything like a Vulcan, or a clown.
Yeah, they said all they really did was cut the eyes a little bit and like make them a little bit different, and then they teased the hair out a ton, painted it white, and that was basically all that they did.
And talk more about the production and the resourcefulness involved. They filmed in Southern California, but they had to make it look like the Midwestern suburbs. So there, it was mentioned a couple times when we were watching it, like, oh, why is it still daylight at 6 o'clock? Well, it would be dark in October in Illinois, but they're filming in Southern California, so they had to deal with what they had. They just filmed the local live oak trees and tried to avoid like palms and things that made it more obvious that it was on the West Coast. And they had their own hand-painted trash bags of leaves. They had 5 or 10 trash bags full of leaves that they just carried around from location to location and made everybody litter them out and about. And then when the scene was done, they had to go pick up every fucking leaf and put it back because they couldn't afford to replace them.
And this included the actors. Jamie Lee Curtis was like, yeah, we were all on leaf pickup when they yelled cut. Carpenter, the actors, everybody's just picking up these painted leaves.
How am I supposed to rate these leaves? How am I supposed to rate these leaves with these spandex denim jeans on here?
So, we talked about Tommy Lee Wallace and Deborah Hill being unsung heroes. To me, the other unsung hero of Halloween, and really, God, without his involvement, it's not Halloween. Dean Cundy, the cinematographer. He had previously worked with Deborah Hill on exploitation movies, Bare Knuckles, and Satan's Cheerleaders.
Classics.
And pretty much all of the lighting effects, it's some that you take for granted and not, we do so much research in preparing these episodes. I've watched some great documentaries, Halloween 25 Years of Terror, Halloween The Inside Story. I've watched a couple of John Carpenter documentaries, read tons of articles. So it's cool to see these things that even I didn't know going into this. Cundy specifically lit Michael Myers' face when he comes out of the darkness a certain way to make it stand out like that. So it wasn't just the shape out of the light stepping into the light. They specifically timed the lighting on that to follow his face as he stepped in and create that ghostly image. All of the way they lit the houses, making them blue and kind of also ghostly and phantom looking, which it was just supposed to be a simple suburb, but the lighting added that atmosphere.
Yeah, it's just very small, minute things that you don't think about. When you're watching it, you don't go, why does it look blue? It's just a really small thing that they slip in there that really added to the overall, the way the production looked. Because we'll learn later about the money they spent, which wasn't much, but Dean Cundy made it look like they spent way more money than they did on it, just by his expertise.
Oh, he did, and there's another way that he was really a hero of the film is that Carpenter had to simplify production in a lot of ways because some of his more elaborate ideas just weren't going to happen. They weren't going to be done on the shooting schedule they had. So he and Cundy together created the Panaglide device, which was extremely innovative at the time. It allowed for big sweeping shots without the herky-jerky motion. It was like a device that basically the camera operator wore like a backpack, but it was around his front, and then he had the camera was attached to it, but not on him. So the camera's always maintaining a mostly steady shot. So as you can see, that's how they got the big sweeping shots of the neighborhood and the shots from the intro and other very important things. And then as we round out the coroner's report here, we'll talk about the casting.
Yeah, the casting was one of the hugely important things that made the movie as good as it was. One of the craziest things to talk about on the casting was the casting of Dr. Loomis, where they actually, and this was against the advice of Erwin Yablans, They actually first went after Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee to both play that part. They both passed. Christopher Lee later has said in multiple interviews that it was the biggest mistake he ever made in his life when it comes down to turning down a role. Yeah, they went after them, and Yablans didn't think. He's like, as soon as you put those guys in the movie, it makes it a Hammer movie. Like, it gives it that feel like we don't want that. Luckily, they passed, and they were able to move on to Donald Pleasance, which obviously, actor-wise, he's really the MVP of the whole Halloween franchise.
Oh, yeah. Pleasance was a good chunk of the budget went to him. I think he got $25,000.
Yeah, the actual budget for the movie, they say it's $300. Yablans says it's actually $330, that they went back and got an extra $30,000 to pay him. So he got $30,000 of the $330,000. And so when he was on set, they made it special. Like, he was only there for a few days to shoot, but they actually brought in a trailer. He was the only one that had his own trailer. Like, they really tried to make it look like a professional endeavor whenever Donald Pleasance was around, because they respected him that much.
And we mentioned the teenage girls. They were integral to the whole plot working. Linda was cast as PJ Souls from Carrie fame at that point. She was one of the bullies in Carrie. Carpenter was a big fan of the movie, but the way that he cast her was strictly because of the way she said totally. That was how he envisioned it in his mind for the character. That was a big part of it. She said it exactly like he wanted to hear it. So she got the role. Interesting to note that the success of Halloween actually landed her the role in Rock and Roll High School amongst the Ramones, and later as the female lead in Stripes opposite Bill Murray. Me, Muji, and Annie actually got to hang out with PJ Souls a few years ago for like 2 or 3 fucking hours at a Comic-Con or a horror con. There was like just nobody there. And so she really liked us, and we were just bullshitting, and we got to hear so many cool stories, and that was just a really great experience. Annie Brackett was cast as Nancy Loomis, who was the wife of Tommy Lee Wallace at the time.
Yeah, there's a great documentary. Oh, actually, I think it's on the 25 Years of Terror. They obviously ask her about something about her casting, and all she simply says is, I was cast because John Carpenter had seen me in another movie. I don't think that's true.
Well, she was also in Assault on Precinct 13.
Yeah, she was good, but she was also the girlfriend of his best friend during both of those movies, to which Tommy Lee Wallace worked on both of those movies.
Yeah, and
not saying she wasn't good. She was good, but it's okay if your friend casts you because they're your friend.
She was good at something.
Well, I wouldn't agree that it was acting.
And she also went on to do The Fog, which is a huge John Carpenter fan favorite. That's one of my top Carpenter movies.
Yeah, Fog's great.
We'll definitely...
I mean, a future season, we'll definitely do The Fog.
Yep.
Be away the fog.
And it was Deborah Hill, again, who suggested this time Jamie Lee Curtis be cast as Laurie Strode due to the fact that she was the daughter of Janet Leigh of Psycho fame and was also under contract at Universal. She was 19 at the time.
It's a real pro wrestling move, honestly, where you go like, how are we going to sell this movie? And then on the poster, you put the daughter of Janet Leigh, bringing in the new generation of horror, which is a really great idea, but it really was something that they didn't do a lot in movies back then. It was more of a wrestling or outside of the Hollywood type of way to promote entertainment, but was super smart.
Oh, they ran publicity photos of Jamie Lee and Janet Leigh side by side, newspaper articles and things trying to drum up hype for the movie.
Yeah, Halloween is also it's a genius in marketing with no money too. It's just, they had all sorts of great ideas that led to the success of the movie.
It was Carpenter's film school buddy Nick Castle that got the call to be the Shape or Michael Myers. At least 5 people donned the mask overall in the production. Tony Moran was hired to be the face of adult Myers. Stuntman Jim Winberg played him for most of the action shots. Tommy Lee Wallace even played him during the stabbing Laurie scene because he built all the sets, so he knew he could quickly knock them down. He knew where to hit them to make them collapse, which I thought that was interesting. And also the closet scene. And then Deborah Hill even played Michael Myers in one scene on a wide shot. And Will Sandin played 6-year-old Myers.
Yeah, Deborah actually even played him on the shot at the very beginning of the movie when he picks up the mask, she says that if you watch it really close, you can see that it's obviously a female, like a well-manicured female's hands that come up and pick up the mask.
I absolutely noticed that as well. I think it was also her hands for the knife when the drawer opened, because I was like, that's a woman's hand, not a child's hand. And then when the mask went and put on, I was like, yeah, that's definitely a woman's hand. And then her other scene was when the little boy, what's his name, Tommy Doyle, that he when he was saying, no, the boogeyman's outside, he's outside, and she's like, there's nobody out there, that's Deborah Hill's
the
scene.
way shorter Michael Myers,
super short, looks like he's super far away, or the house is really big.
Yes.
All of a sudden,
the shape psychology was just supposed to be a force of nature, as we mentioned, pure evil, no motive, no intent. But Nick Castle did provide what little personality was added to Myers with his movements, things like the head tilt, the kind of the swagger that he walked with. There were some little personalizations that he gave, but Myers, as was the intention, was a deadpan character. That was what he was supposed to be.
Yeah, Nick Castle actually tells some great stories where he's like asking Carpenter when he's supposed to be chasing Laurie across the street. He's like, well, what's my motivation? What am I supposed to be doing? And Carpenter's like, just walk across the street, Nick.
And then it was rounded out with the supporting cast, the children, Lindsay Wallace, Tommy Doyle, and Lee Brackett. The sheriff was played by Charles Lee Cyphers, veteran character actor. Supporting cast all had pretty short weeks. Most of them just worked 3 to 5 days. So for the 21-day shoot, it was mostly the main cast on the set for that. Carpenter was apparently very casual on set. He believed in the people he hired and didn't really micromanage their performances. It was also shot in Panavision with the best lenses around and processed at MGM Labs. The sound was done at Goldman Sound. So what money they had to spend, they tried to spend it wisely on that end of things to make sure the final product was what it was. And that will wrap up this coroner's report, as we now know exactly what all led up to the making of the movie. But now it's been cast, production has started, the movie happened. Now let's find out some interesting facts on the auditorium.
Step right up and enter a world where the mortal man will find facts that defy imagination. What strange truths and morbid curiosities will be revealed inside the auditorium.
Time for some discussion on the interesting tidbits of the movie. Feel free to chime in with anything that you also observed or found as well from our illustrious panel here. So, first of all, 2018 is the 40th anniversary of that movie. Holy shit. 40 years. Can you believe that?
No, we're just all old fucks now. Most of us.
I'm not.
Most of us.
So I can believe it. I wasn't alive for most of the time that it was out, so suck it.
It's insane how great it looks. I mean, we just watched the movie. A little insight on the podcasters. We like to refresh ourselves. Most of us have seen a lot of these movies. We watched them directly before just so we can, come right out with our thoughts fresh in our mind. And, I mean, it looks great for a movie that was shot in the 70s.
Oh, it's, again, Dean Cundy, man. The cinematography, those shots were just not... They were risky. They were not traditional and not what was being done at the time, and it really had an impact. One interesting fact, Haddonfield was where Deborah Hill grew up. Haddonfield, New Jersey. Sam Loomis was named after a character from Psycho, played by actor John Gavin.
Oh, I assumed it was a reference to old Annie Brackett up there.
Just got lucky on that one. Yeah, just a coincidence.
But speaking of Brackett, Lee Brackett was named after the screenwriter of Carpenter's idol Howard Hawks' movie Rio Bravo.
And then Michael Myers, the best tribute of them all, was named after a big financer of Assault on Precinct 13 as like a thank you for financing a movie, which apparently that guy didn't take the way that you should and was not happy about Michael Myers being named after him.
Apparently he was a really nice guy and he didn't get the joke, I guess.
It's like, thanks, man.
He was British too, so it might have been a cultural humor barrier, I'm not sure, but yeah, he apparently didn't care for it.
No, sir, I do not like it.
You know, we mentioned Carpenter was a lifelong musician. He came from a musical family. The score on this movie, it was done in 3 days. He did the score because it was cheap and fast. We think, oh man, Carpenter's this genius. He had these minimal tools. He made this he wasn't trying to create a masterpiece when he sat down and made it. He was trying to get the fucking sound done on his movie so he could get it finished.
Yeah, and he said when he was writing it, like he said, it was just a simple thing. He's like, the way that his dad taught him to play drums was just a steady little beat, and he's like, I'm just going to do that on
5/4 time.
Yeah, on this keyboard, and that's what ended up being the most iconic horror music of all time. That
background music, the very back of that song, though, does sound like the sickest beat is about to drop at any moment. It's like... with all this other, you're like, oh, it's going to drop, and then it never does. So it just keeps building that anticipation.
This makes me think of the People's Court.
And speaking of the movie, it's also funny that they had an early screening before he scored the movie, and basically nobody liked it. And there was a big-time movie executive that was like, it's just not scary. Like, I don't know what you've done, but this movie's not scary at all. So you can see how big of a difference it makes in those scenes. And actually, so there's a lot of extras on a few different DVDs where you can watch where they just show Michael chasing Laurie around with no music, and it's like, yeah, this is a totally different experience than when you plug that Halloween music in the background. It makes all the difference.
Oh yeah, they definitely use the timing with the music really well to create the emotion. When she's finally stabbed him with the knife, and she's like, okay, I for sure got him. That wasn't a knitting needle. That wasn't a wire hanger. I stabbed him in his chest with a knife. He's dead. And then he does the big sit-up, and it's like silent. And then the music is just bing, right as he sits up. And then when he turns, it says like bing. And you're like, oh, oh, oh. And I love that every time. It's like in the Friday the 13th video game where you know he's getting close because you can hear the music start and you feel your butthole pucker up real tight and you're like, oh God, here he comes.
Fantastic. I probably knew of the music before I did the movie. You know, I think you hear that music as a kid in the background. If you grew up with cable, you most certainly had TBS. Those movies were in syndication a lot. So even if you weren't watching it, if you were watching the Braves or wrestling, it's very likely Halloween was going off before the program you were going to watch was coming on. So you heard that music before you even knew what Michael Myers was.
I think it's very easily compared to maybe The Exorcist with Tubular Bells. Just a very familiar melody where you're instantly taken to there, and it just instantly gives you that chill.
And it's really, this style of score has come back huge when you think of like Stranger Things, and essentially everything has started copying it, but it took all of its inspiration from Halloween and other movies of that time frame, where instead of having like the big over the top, and especially scores for a long time, probably 20 years, went to let's make them as metal as possible, which is fine, but it's not really that scary. Really, people started going back to like this just simplified, natural sounds that are a lot creepier.
Well, I mean, that's a good contrast there, though. It's talking about all the movies that try to like metal up their soundtracks. You're not scared anymore. Now you're like rooting for the murders. You're like, yeah, get them! Instead of being anxious about stuff. It like changes the whole tone. I kind of want somebody to do that as an experiment, is take Halloween and put metal score to the Mike Myers scene, like replace it and see how it changes it. Now are you as scared, or are you more just...
I think you just pumped.
Just pumped for him to come on screen and just...
The simple keyboard, they did a kind of a remake of it in Halloween 4, where it was a little different, but it was still the simple keyboard melody. We were talking about this on the porch earlier. I loved H2O the first time I saw it, and I went back and watched it. It's still a good movie, but the one thing that really bothers me about that movie now is the score, because it's too big. It's too well produced. There's like strings and a fucking orchestra behind it. It's like brr, brr, brr.
It is gigantic, especially there's a scene in that movie where Michael is walking down this hall and the windows on both sides are open and the curtains are blowing in all directions and he looks like a superhero, like coming after somebody, not someone you want to be running from.
So the contrast to the simplicity in this one.
Oh, absolutely. You know, it's kind of like if you go to the way they did the music with the dissonance from the chord structure and things. You know, that's the kind of thing that really, by its nature, makes you feel a little uneasy on the inside. You know, it's kind of like nails on a chalkboard, something like that. Well, think about if you go to a large concert, and as human beings, like a baby crying, that's going to get your attention, right? Well, if you're in this huge concert with all this noise, you're not really going to hear it. So the big score, it kind of drowns everything out. But when you dial it back, and you're in a restaurant with 3 other people, there's a baby crying over here, holy shit, your nerves are like, what the hell is wrong with this baby? So, you know, there's that huge difference with overdoing it and going over the top with the score, like you said. And it really does make a difference on making that unsettled feeling that you get when you watch it in the more simplified version.
Yeah, really. I mean, it's a pretty quiet movie from beginning to end. The music is more atmospheric. I mean, there's themes thrown in there, and they really only amp up when some serious action is happening, but most of it's pretty damn quiet. And I think that has a lot to it.
It does, because the music's used for maximum effect in that case. Like, every little note that strikes is done with purpose. And speaking of the simplification of things, the scene with Bob and Linda, which I love that scene, is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. It shows Michael Myers, I think, from a writing perspective as a bit of a prankster. And hear me out here, I have a little bit of a crazy theory about Michael Myers. Have you ever noticed, and you know, we're talking about 9 movies written by completely different people, so there's really not any correlation except for what we create here, but bear with me a moment. Michael Myers never kills children. Is it possible that he is emotionally stunted at 6 when he first committed the murders, and on the inside thinks he's a child and therefore will not kill a child because it's one of his own?
I mean, he knew where those kids were in the house.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some of the movies he definitely tried to kill kids in Halloween 4 and 5. He made the attempts, but especially in the early movies, yeah, he definitely walked by a lot of kids and stuff. That's probably true, and it's also true that something that they went away from in the later movies, but was really the core of the first one, is he gets a lot more satisfaction out of scaring them and setting it up. Killing them is just like, I guess I have to kill them now. Like, it's really all about just scaring the shit out of them to maximum effect before he actually kills them. I mean, all of the pranks he does throughout the movie, that's his main thing, is like he just really wants to stalk them. I mean, he has opportunities to kill where he doesn't, but he just wants to really pull some cool pranks.
Yeah, he spent a lot of time setting up that scare room. That was really striking, I think. Kind of funny in a couple of parts.
He just wants to do hood rat stuff with his friends. I mean, he's just having a good time. He thought that the kids would think it was funny. Like, they're watching horror movies. Let's scare the babysitters. Yeah. And then he's like, oh, crap, now I gotta kill them.
Yeah, they're almost like toys to him. Like, he pulls off the scare and he discards them. Like, well, no more use for you. You've seen my trick. On to the next person.
That point is highlighted in the scene where the 3 boys are picking on Tommy Doyle. One of them's running away, and he's caught by Michael Myers. You see him, he's got his hands around his shoulders, and he's tightening his grip, and you see the fear in the kid's eyes, but he lets him go. You know, he doesn't have to, but he does. And that's pretty much the end of it. You know, if you go back to the first scene of the movie where he kills his sister, it's like he's punishing teenagers. Why? Because they seem to be doing something forbidden. You know, it's this classic horror film motif, but maybe it was Halloween that set the stage for this. They're doing something forbidden, and as a young child, he's aware of this, and this is locked into him somehow. So, yes, he does get out sometime later. He sees children, and even though these children are little shits in and of themselves, you know, other kids, you know, he lets them go because there's really nothing to gain. But the teenagers we see in this film, except for Laurie, you know, unless you want to count the pot smoking in the car, you know, they're all doing something similar to what his sister was doing in the beginning of the film, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because Carpenter even said, like, and obviously, like, an author's intent, you know, isn't always what comes across, like, what they intend to do, and, like, how everyone observes it, you know, could be different, and, you know, sometimes what they try to do is not what actually ends up happening. But he said he never even tried to do that. He was like, just the fact that Linda and Bob and, you know, got killed, some of them got killed after doing things like having sex or other things you're not supposed to do. He's like, it was just opportunity. It was a good way to sneak up on them because they're not thinking about anything. They're thinking about sex. It wasn't his intention to, like, make it, that's a taboo, that's why you're going to get killed. But it is what happened, and a lot of other movies, like, took that and ran with it. And so even though he didn't intend for that to happen, it is really what set that precedent in horror movies.
I do think that he actually took it and ran with it and made it that, because he probably saw the way it was set up and decided to run with it, because otherwise, why would he kill Annie first and then put his sister's headstone above her? He put her out, you know, like crucifix style with his sister's tombstone above her head. So, I mean, he's clearly making a statement. Here's all you whores like my sister. You know, he's killing her, you know, like, he's like killed them topless like his sister was right after they're having sex or trying to go have sex and spill butter all over yourself.
Well, yeah, like
call it lube, move on, but would have lived. I mean, she would have lived if she had just gone over to her boyfriend's house in a t-shirt or something. I don't know.
He claims that he didn't have that intent, but it's definitely the way that it comes across in the movie. Like, then the author's intent is not always what ends up happening.
I think he just changed his mind once he saw the way it happened. He was like, yeah, okay, we'll just do that.
Yeah, he's kind of a surly old guy. Love him. Halloween's my favorite movie ever. But he is very contrarian. I think sometimes he shoots things down just because he wants to be an asshole. Maybe that is one of the things he did.
Well, speaking of that, we're talking about the Bob and Linda scene, which kind of led to that whole discussion. PJ Souls, and she told us this when we were talking to her, but also on a couple of the documentaries I watched, that Carpenter was slightly embarrassed to ask about the nude scene, and, you know, he's a little awkward about it. Now, when you interview him on the flip side of that, where he's been asked about it, he says that's all bullshit. It was in the script. Everything was as it was planned, and he doesn't understand why she would say that. But, funnily enough, they both thought the scene went fantastic. So I guess, who cares who was telling the truth? But John Carpenter tends to deny, as Muji was saying, most anything anyone says about him. So after spending some time with PJ and what a sweet and genuine person that she was, at this point I gotta believe her. Sorry, John. Some other interesting facts here. Bob's murder in that scene was done with two guys lifting him up from behind outside of the scene, and then him standing on a box and holding a knife under his arm.
The same way we did it as kids when he got murdered playing games. He was doing it in a live action film.
It's a hell of a knife.
And he had said that one of his most proud scenes that he'd ever done was his foot death of him dangling there with his where it shows him dying and it pans down and his little feet go. He said that's one of like his most proud acting moments.
See, that's one of those scenes that when I watch it, I'm kind of like, there's a lot of shit in this that, you know, it's not exactly reality. But that scene, for whatever reason, I'm like, wait a minute. How the hell does that work? How is that knife going to hold you up? I thought last time somebody died, you jerked around like a chicken with their head cut off. Wait a minute here. Something has crossed the line. This is not right.
Well, if he hit him in the heart, he would die instantly. But it looked like lower down, like in his intestine or something.
It looked like in his rib cage or something, which would be the only way it would hold him up is if it was in the sternum, because then it would rest on the blade and not cut through. Or if it was like
good luck going through a sternum with a knife. That thing would be like,
well, not like in the like right here, and it's resting over it, like the wishbone.
How, you know, how his head stayed up the way it did. You know,
up against the wall.
That was really
alert.
It was really Michael's first, like, kind of supernatural moment. Up until that point in the film, he'd done some stuff, but that was really the first time that he did something that wasn't just something that the average person could do.
The things you think are probably complicated when watching Halloween, reading about the production, it's just ingenuity. It's really genius how they were able to do so much with very little. One other tidbit, interesting to note, that some of the actors went through a little bit of torture. Jamie Lee Curtis had a first rough couple of days on set, but she kicked it. She apparently didn't think she was doing a good job, and Carpenter gave her a call reassuring her. Nick Castle, poor guy, did the carjacking scene in 40-degree weather soaking wet.
When at the beginning of the movie.
Yes.
at the hospital.
The opening scene was shot on the very last day of production. It was the last thing they shot. It was 1 4-minute shot with a couple of cuts that they've fessed up to over the years, but still very impressive. Carpenter had never attempted anything like that before, and he gambled the entire last day of production on that idea.
And also, one of the big parts, one of the reasons they had to wait for so long is because the house was actually the way that it looks throughout the rest of the movie. Like, it was an old, abandoned, crappy house. And so what they did was they needed to make it look like it was 15 years younger. So they actually painted it, the outside, and then only painted the parts of the inside that they were going to have on camera for that scene. So they had to like try to make that. They had to young the house up. They put the furniture in and everything. Like, they did all of that at the very end of the shoot. And then, made the house look like it was actually, it was livable.
They had lights moving around the camera the entire time. So it's not like they had stationary lights set up, because if they did, he would go into the path of where those lights were set up, trying to get this 1 4-minute shot. So when he would go into the house, or when he'd go around the house, the lights were there with him, moving around for him, following him up the stairs, and they managed to get that amazingly. It was filmed by cameraman Ray Stella, whose ass it thoroughly kicked.
So didn't the contraption he had to wear, it was like 45 pounds, and they shot it something like 9 times in a row overnight at the end of a long day of painting a house in one day.
It's like wearing a tuba.
Or worse.
They weigh about that, 45, 50 pounds.
Tuba facts.
Tuba facts.
Subscribe now. Press 1 to subscribe.
On our sister channel, Tuba Facts.
So they shot 2 endings for the movie. One was Loomis looks down and is surprised that Michael Myers is gone. And another that he looks down and it's like, fuck, I knew it, and fuck, I knew it won. So that was the ending that we got.
Well, of course it is. I mean, throughout the movie, he kept yelling, I know him!
I done told you, he's pure evil, damn it!
I done told you. I known him for 15 years. I knows him. Don't question me.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him.
And 7 being his friend.
It adds up to 15 years, just so we're clear.
And now, in 2018, where a sequel is pretty much par for the course, where sequels are expected, encouraged, and hoped for in many cases, you go back and watch that, and I think that is the first thing you think when you see the ending. It's like, oh, he's still out there, gotta be a sequel. Not really what they were going for. It's ultimately what happened. Let's not fucking fool ourselves here. But it's not what they were going for. It was actually created in the cutting room by Tommy Lee Wallace to make you feel like the shape could be anywhere. So it pans throughout the neighborhood to different locations you've been in the movie and different houses in the neighborhood, that it's a quaint, quiet little suburban town that nothing bad ever happens in, but now he's loose. And he could be anywhere. He could be in your house.
I think they came across. I mean, that's the feeling I got from it.
Yeah, as a kid watching that movie, that's exactly what I came across the first time I saw it. I definitely came out of it being like that, like, oh shit, like he could be anywhere.
I mean, we all know he lives across the street from Todd anyway, so.
That's true. Like, let's tell a quick story. Just very quick. Todd has a fucking neighbor who his kids are creeped out by, which is hilarious, but I thought it was fucking awesome. So we go trick-or-treating with Todd and his family every year.
In his adorable neighborhood.
And one of his neighbors had a stereo blasting the Halloween theme, which was cool, but he has this other neighbor down the block that has a dude in their yard dressed like Michael Myers, and he jumps out from the bushes and scares people as you walk by, and it's so fucking cool.
I had forgotten about that.
He's gotten good at it over the years, too. Because it used to be he would just, like, stand in the yard like a yard prop. And then as you got close, he'd be like, "Ugh!" And you're like, that's not what he does, bro. Watch the movie. And then this past year, it was really good because he was not in his own yard. He was in the bushy, wooded area between houses, back off the road, and you didn't know he was there. And then as you came up, he would just appear. And I was like, that's it. And of course, our nearly 6 at the time, now 6-year-old daughter, well, she was already freaked out by the neighbor playing the theme song. She's like, "That's Michael Myers' theme song. He's here. Michael Myers, we gotta watch out for Michael Myers. I hear his theme song. I can hear him. He's near." And because she, she
like,
just,
"Oh no, he's not."
No, he's not.
He is.
And then turns out down the street, yeah, he was.
And then he pops out, which was made for a great Halloween.
And then his mom gives you candy from the front porch.
He's gotten really good at it.
So the influence of the movie felt far and wide, so let's break down the numbers of it all.
Basically, it made a shit ton of money. The budget was $330,000 ended up being the final budget, which adjusted for inflation, today's dollars, $1.2 million is about what that is. It made $70 million during its box office run, which right now is about $278 million. At the time it ended the run, it was the most successful independent movie in the history of movies. Just to give you an example, Get Out, which was hugely successful last year, made for $4.5 million, made $255. So Halloween, adjusted for inflation, cheaper and even made more money than that, off of a very micro budget to advertise as well. These days, most movies spend at least 3 times their budget just on doing ads. I mean, actually, the Blumhouse movies spend more. It's kind of their big thing. But Halloween, they also had very little money to advertise. It was really just word of mouth. But like I said, at the time that it got out of the theater, the most successful independent movie that had ever been made.
Interestingly enough, from the critical standpoint, early reviews were awful. When it premiered in October of '78, at that time, movie releases were a little more regionalized than they are now. So not everybody got a release at the same time. They were staggered. Each market kind of determined its own release schedule. So the first wave of reviews came in for Halloween were terrible. Carpenter fully expected to be a bomb to the point that he pretty much written it off. He was like, okay, well, I guess that didn't work out. It's a shame. I enjoyed it, but it is what it is. So he was off to his next thing. He even screened it at his own college at USC Film School. They ran it for an audience of students, and they all panned it and said it was a low-class, trashy horror film.
Yeah, one of the kids stood up and asked him, was like, "You went here to USC, the most prestigious film school in America. Why would you make this?"
Poor guy.
But there was some light at the end of the tunnel. Tom Allen at the Village Voice and Roger Ebert, of all people, who gave it a 4-star review, and those reviews changed public perception, and soon it became a huge hit. And so Halloween has lived on thanks to home video, and now DVD and Blu-ray, and hopefully we'll get like a Scream Factory or Arrow or one of
some
the
sort
really
of great 4K remaster.
Yes, I'm really waiting on a top tier re-release of Halloween. That would be nice. But if you're not familiar with the plot, I guess we have to explain it to you. It is now time to uncover the burial plot. It was Halloween night, 1963. Judith Myers and her lover are watching TV. Outside of her window, someone is watching, and when the young lovers go upstairs, the creeper starts plotting. He moves around the house and through the back door. He grabs a big butcher knife and a mask off the floor.
Michael!
Hey guys, this isn't scary.
Yeah, you're right.
I think that movie executive was right. We do need the music.
Hold on, one moment please.
Yeah, that's so much better.
Michael!
And down comes the butcher knife. Her chest becomes red. Over and over it comes down until Judith Myers is dead. Michael rushes out of the house, but a car blocks his escape. It's Judith Myers' parents, but this must be a mistake. Judith's father pulls off Michael's mask, and suddenly everyone's blood runs cold. Michael is Judith's brother, and he's only 6 years old.
Michael?
Fast forward 15 years, October 30th, 1978, a night that would become famous, the night Michael Myers escaped. Dr. Loomis knows the danger. He's Michael's psychiatrist. The nurse mentions rehabilitation, but Loomis won't even try it.
He hasn't spoken a word in 15 years.
The patients are roaming around in the yard, so Michael takes the opportunity to steal Loomis's car.
He's gone from here! The evil is gone!
It's Halloween in Haddonfield. Enter Laurie Strode, the final girl. She's walking to school with young Tommy Doyle without a care in the world. She drops keys off at the Myers house just as her realtor dad wanted. Tommy Doyle's schoolmate has warned him that the Myers house is haunted.
Lonnie Elam said this is a haunted house. Lonnie Elam said awful things happened in that house.
Lonnie Elam probably won't get out of the 6th grade.
But Lonnie Elam turns out to be right. Right now, Laurie doesn't know it. Michael Myers is watching from inside the house, and his next victim had been chosen. And by next victim, we mean 20 years later in a terrible movie. Michael Myers gets beat up by Busta Rhymes, but fuck, spoilers, I guess. Michael follows her to school, and as she's walking home, her friends Annie and Linda think he's Devin Graham, but they are deadly wrong.
Hey, jerk! Speed kills! Ugh! I hate a boy with a car and no sense of humor.
When Laurie's friends are gone, she just knows she's not alone. When she runs into Sheriff Brackett, she is chilled to the bone.
Oh!
Excuse me, Laurie.
I'm sorry, Mr. Brackett.
You know, it's Halloween. I guess everyone is entitled to one good scare.
One good scare.
One good scare.
One good scare.
Productions. Then Sheriff Brackett watched Laurie walk off in a very creeper way. This isn't going to rhyme, just an observation. Dr. Loomis is trying to warn everyone in town, and he finds out that Judith Myers' tombstone is missing from the ground.
He came home.
As Nancy and Laurie smoke the dope and go over babysitting plans, Michael follows them to Lindsay Wallace and Tommy Doyle's houses just as close as he can.
Seriously? Like, how the fuck couldn't they tell that they were being followed? It's the same car that freaked out on them earlier, and it follows them right behind them for like an hour.
Back at the Myers house, Sheriff Brackett accuses Loomis of being scared that night, and in one of horror's all-time great speeches, Loomis proves he is right.
Seems to me you're just plain scared.
Yes. Yeah, I am. I met him 15 years ago. I was told there was nothing left. No reason, no conscience, no understanding, and even the most rudimentary sense of life or death, of good or evil, right or wrong. I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face, and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up, because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Michael stalks Annie. She plans for a wild night ahead, but Michael is in the back seat of a car, and now Annie is dead. Across the street, Tommy tries to scare Lindsay. Behind the curtains he hides, but he looks out the window and sees the boogeyman has arrived.
Oh! The boogeyman! It's the boogeyman!
Stop acting like an ass, Tommy.
No one believes me.
I do.
Asshole kids.
Meanwhile, back at the Myers house,
Hey, Lonnie, get your ass away from there.
Linda and Bob show up to the Wallaces and realize they are alone. so they go upstairs to get their freak on. And after some super short sex, Linda wants a beer. Bob tells her all the romantic things a girl wants to hear.
I'll be right back. Don't get dressed.
Michael kills Bob, then goes back to the bedroom. He presents himself to Linda in a sweet ghost costume.
See anything you like?
Yeah! Shh! Oh, sorry.
Totally.
Michael did see something he liked, but it wasn't the tits. He saw that his prank had worked. Now killing time could commence. Michael strangled Linda as Laurie listened on the phone. At first, she thought it was a classic sex prank, but realized something was wrong. Laurie goes to the Wallace house and finds Annie dead on the bed. One by one, she discovers that all of her friends are dead. And here comes Michael out of nowhere. He stabs Laurie's shoulder, then she falls down the stairs and the chase is on. Laurie crawls on the floor. She makes it to the Doyle house, but is locked outside the door.
The keys! Oh, the keys!
She makes it inside, but Michael's not far behind. She stabs him with a crocheting needle, but then throws down his knife. Stupid. She hides in the closet, then stabs him in the eye. Stabs him in the chest. Why won't he just die? She sends Tommy and Lindsay down the street to get help. Wait, is she just going to stand there with her back to Michael? The answer is yep. Michael chokes Laurie, but she grabs his mask and removes it. And just in time for the save is the good Dr. Loomis.
Pew, 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 pew.
Loomis shoots Michael 6 times until his bullets are gone. And off the balcony he falls and onto the lawn. But when Loomis looks back, Michael is gone. And he's not surprised because...
It was the boogeyman.
As a matter of fact, it was.
So if it's October 31st and you hear a scream, it may just be Michael Myers wishing you a happy Halloween. So time to wrap up this edition of Seeking Human Victims as we all go around the table and summarize our final thoughts on Halloween. If Alfred Hitchcock invented the slasher genre with Psycho, Carpenter certainly succeeded with his goal of turning that back around on its head and making it myth, but it did something much more than that. It really truly started the slasher genre as we know it. Even one of the greatest horror franchises of all time, Friday the 13th, is a clone of Halloween. It was inspired by this one film. All of the great Canadian horror from the 80s, all of the great Tom Savini effects movies, all of those slasher movies, the great ones, the not so great ones as well, all inspired by Halloween. One of my all-time favorite movies, especially going back to when I watched it a lot in high school with a more analytical eye than I did as a kid. It may be a damn near perfect horror movie. I don't know if I've ever seen a horror movie that's better. I've seen a lot that you could probably argue are as good, but I have never seen one better.
It was one of those films that I recall seeing bits and pieces, because it was on all the time, and you do pick up the music first because it just stands out. So I remember seeing it in bits and pieces. I recall when I saw it, I wasn't that interested in horror at the time, and I think it was somewhere around high school when I also sat down and finally watched it. I thought, man, this is great. This is where it's at. You know, like we talked before, it's not over the top. It's not over the top, I guess. It seems like shortly thereafter, horror started going way over the top. And I think even in the franchises, it started going over the top later on. But this was, I don't want to say bare bones, but it was just stripped down to just enough to make it unsettling. And, that's what I really liked about it and what I take away from it. It had been years since I had seen it until tonight. And boy, it's still just as good. One of the greats.
For me, this was the first full watch. Like Jeremy said, I've seen bits and pieces of it on TV, and the scene that stood out for me back then when I saw bits and pieces of it still is probably my favorite scene. When Laurie is stuck in the closet and he bursts in, and it's a definitive scene because it shows where the money went. Like all the lighting and cinematography is perfect right then and there. Like the light shining in through the grates on the door, and then like they're messing around with the light, and then I don't know. This movie's all suspense, and it's a really subdued, quiet movie, like I said before, and the horror is different than what you get from other movies, even of the same genre, because it's not about gore. It's all about the impending doom of Michael Myers. Where is he going to appear next? That face is scary as shit. Another moment I really liked was the scene where he just sits up. It's scary as shit. There's no way around it. I love that part in particular. But yeah, it was great.
I can't necessarily remember the first time I saw the film, but I do remember watching it a lot in high school, probably with you, as a matter of fact. The Hitchcock connection has been made already. There's a lot of Hitchcock elements, but there's also this feeling of kind of a transition. You know, we saw later in the 80s, it's kind of a forerunner of a lot of slasher films. You see, it's interesting to see it's kind of a stopgap between the 60s suspense, which obviously had an influence on Carpenter, and then he's taking that further. There's not a terrible lot of blood in this movie. It does exist. There is some brief nudity. There is some brief gore, very very brief. That's not the focus. The focus is on the suspense, and that really gets you. Everybody's talked about their favorite scene of the Michael Myers, the surprise. My favorite is probably when Laurie first discovers the bodies, and she's crying. She's backed herself up against the wall, and you see the darkness, and then you see the white face and the contrast there. I think that's probably the perfect scene in the film of just giving Michael Myers this blank, unexplainable evil. And I think that's just that unexplainable element in this film. Why is he doing it? You see Loomis. Loomis is this character saying, "I've tried to find it, I can't find it." And he's the contrast to Myers the whole time. He's got this frantic nature about him. He's trying to stop him. Myers seems to have this calculated evil about himself, where he's just relentless. Whereas Loomis, he's stopped at every turn by something. The sane world, where Myers is this insanity, but there's this calculated evil to it that's just unstoppable. And that's what makes the film so interesting for me, is just how unstoppable he is. And
yeah, for me, it's like last week. I know a lot of people said that the Night of the Living Dead on our last podcast was the introduction. This was my introduction to horror. I saw it way too young, like probably 5 or 6 years old. I saw it the first time. I was being babysat by my crazy uncle, and he was just like, "Yeah, like, let's watch this movie." And it scared the shit out of me, and continued for years and years. It's what started my obsession with horror. It's one of the first movies that I've ever actually bought, like on VHS. It was the first DVD and Blu-ray that I bought. Like, it's been, since I was a kid, it's stayed my all-time favorite movie. Like, regardless of genre, it's always been the number one. And it's one of those that sticks with you. Not very many movies can you watch that you've seen. I've probably seen it over 100 times at least at this point. And still, if I'm sitting by myself in a room with the lights out, it still scares me. It still gets me to where I want to get up and look out all the doors and look in all the closets and, make sure there's nothing around, because it is just that good. And it is, I think, the thing that, like, it's, we're kind of well covered at this point, even though Psycho is given credit as the first slasher and there was a bunch of stuff in between, it's the first slasher that proved that you could get rich off making a slasher movie. And so that's why it inspired so many copies. I mean, Sean Cunningham doesn't even, he flat out says, we saw Halloween and said, hey, we want to get on that money. Let's make our own horror icon, like the serial killer type. Like without him, like we not only do we not get Jason, we don't get Freddy, we don't get a lot of different, you know, people. I mean, Texas Chainsaw Massacre came a little bit before, but, you know, didn't make a shit ton of money. A lot of slashers like Black Christmas, a lot of different movies had, but it was just like a dude. On this one, they're like, we have to make it a little bit more than that. And then the thing that really makes it my all-time favorite horror movie is just, no matter how many more movies have come since then, and even though at the end he has a couple of like a little bit of superhuman acts, for 90% of the movie, he's just an evil guy that lives in your neighborhood. Like everybody remembers the ghost stories from their neighborhoods when they were a kid. There's always a house or a person, something that you hear about happened in your neighborhood or a place you're not supposed to go. Every like town has its ghost stories, and he's their town's ghost stories. And everyone also remembers seeing the kid, whether you've seen them in person or just seen like on TV. Like you've seen people that have that glassy look in their eye that, like, you know, there's nothing there. And the idea, and I've always said this is like the greatest part of Halloween, the idea is if somebody that lives like in your neighborhood really wanted to try to kill you and you didn't know they were trying to kill you, it would be pretty hard to like survive that because you don't know it's coming. And that's the thing, is that Michael Myers for most of the movie is just a regular person who just wants to murder people, and he doesn't, in this movie at least, he doesn't really have like a motivation. That's later down the line. In this one, he's just an evil guy. He likes to scare people, then he likes to kill them, and how are you going to stop it? So he's just the most irregular. Like Jason, right off the bat, is superhuman. Freddy's in your dreams. Like everybody else, there's more of that superhuman quality. You know, Michael, you know, gets up for some wounds, obviously, that a regular person shouldn't, but for most of that movie, he's just a regular guy. And that's the thing I think that makes it the most scary, is like if there's just an evil person that you don't know about that lives in your neighborhood, what can you really do? And I think that's like the biggest strength of Halloween, and why it still stands up, you know, today as still one of, if not the best horror movie that they've ever made.
Launched a huge franchise, some really good, some not so good, and I'm sure most of which we'll end up covering on this show at some point. It endures, and 2018 will mark another Halloween sequel after many years in dormancy. Of course, it comes on the heels of losing many important people to the Halloween franchise. Mustafa Akkad was killed in a suicide bombing, and then also Deborah Hill died of cancer a few years ago. You know, it's sad that those people were not able to see this sort of reimagining, because what they're doing with the new one, Carpenter is back as a producer. They are completely erasing all of the sequels. It's a direct follow-up to the first movie, and it'll be hitting theaters this Halloween season from Blumhouse. So we're all excited. Jamie Lee Curtis is coming back. Even Nick Castle is coming back as the Shape. So definitely going to be worth checking out when it hits, which should be a couple of months after this podcast drops. We will be back next week here on Seeking Human Victims as we delve into the madness of cannibalism with Tobe Hooper's classic, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We'll see you then.
This is not a test. This is not a test. Please remain calm.
Unburied dead are coming back to life and seeking human victims. Seeking human victims. Seeking human victims.
Okay, that's Halloween, a horror movie we both think is pretty good.
Very good.
One of the things a short scene can't show you is that Halloween is directed and acted with a great deal more artistry and craftsmanship than the sleaze bucket movies we've been talking about. But there's another much more important difference. As you watch Halloween, your basic sympathies are always enlisted on the side of the woman, not with the killer. The movie develops its women characters as independent, intelligent, spunky and interesting people. Halloween does not hate women.
Yeah, you know, when I saw that scene, I must admit I wasn't really worrying about the woman as much as I was placing myself in that closet and thinking about that killer, how I would handle it. And I was also appreciating the fact that I think Halloween not only doesn't hate women, but it loves film and filmmaking. That music is just fabulous. The way he starts one theme, then lays another thing on top of it, keeping the other theme. Really good. Also, the light coming through the slats in that closet. This is a film that's sort of up. That scene is up, and you're jumpy, rather than getting depressed and feeling sorry and feeling sorry that you're even watching it. An upbeat thing.
You know, I think what you're touching on here is that artistry can redeem any subject matter. That's why I've always been opposed to censorship. I don't believe any subject matter should be off base. The question is, what does the artist do with it? How does he look at it? How does he put it through his art in order to make a statement about it, in order to make it into either a commercial film or a serious film? I believe that in the case of a movie like Halloween, we can engage in that joy of filmmaking that you talk about. That's not the case with the other films that really address themselves to the lowest possible common denominator.
So we're not knocking scary pictures,
no,
per se, just a certain kind.